So welcome everybody to our second colloquium of the fall semester. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that SFU sits on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh. And I want to tell you about a few upcoming events. Oh, I was going to grab the title and I've now forgotten to do that. On October 22nd, which is 2 weeks from today, Pat Findell will be defending her dissertation at this hour. So those of you who are faculty in this department, we have a department meeting. But hope everyone else will go to Pat's dissertation, which has been many, many years in the making, and is family stories of survivors of Woodlands patients. Woodlands, for those of you who don't know, Woodlands was a provincial facility in its later years, to house what were understood to be disabled children, and it was one of those ugly, nasty, bad institutions, and it only closed in the 1990s. And Pat's been tracing the history of people who were patients there. On November 8th, in this room, Yuan Wei is going to be defending his dissertation proposal, and so everybody, especially PhD students, are encouraged to attend. And his topic is Queer and Family Activism in Urban China. It's a project on PFLAG in China. And then the final colloquium of the fall season is on November 19th in this room. Helen Kang, a graduate of this department and now a professional researcher in the Vancouver area, is going to be talking about medicine and morality, crisis in the history of a profession. And I'm going to turn it over to Leo Roll, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Blume Oeur is an associate professor of sociology at Tufts University and holds a secondary appointment with the Department of Education. He is a faculty affiliate of the American Studies and the Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program, and is a senior co-chair on the board of directors for the Boston Consortium for Graduate Studies in Gender, Culture, Women, and Sexuality. His research examines the interplay of masculine power, neoliberalism, feminist theory, and Black politics. In his most recent book, Black Boys Apart, he looks at how these themes arise in the context of Black male academies. For the Canadians among us, these schools were created in the 1990s as a way to provide an Afrocentric curriculum to increase resiliency for young Black children. However, in more recent years, Dr. Blume Oeur has argued that they distinguish respectable Black men from their more marginalized peers. Please welcome Dr. Blume Oeur.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out. It's really nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to visiting Professor Stern's class after this talk. It's my first time in Vancouver, and the weather is exactly as I imagined it would be. My wife lived in Portland, Oregon for a number of years, and so every 3 to 4 weeks I was flying back and forth between Portland and Boston to be with her, and we fell in love with this part of the world, and one of our biggest regrets was that we never made it up to Vancouver. The farthest north we made it was the Salmon Islands, which was plenty pretty, but so it's been so nice to be here. And the last thing I'll say, it's been really great to learn more about your department and the synergy between sociology and anthropology. My official title is sociologist, but I was an anthropology major in college. And came very close to being an archaeologist and worked on a Mayan. I thought I was going to spend my career studying Mayan pottery after a summer in Guatemala, but then was teaching in Philadelphia after college, and that really changed the trajectory of my career. But for the anthropologists in the room, I assure you, it remains my first love. The title of my talk is Allyship in the Time of Death: Black Feminism, Black Male Aggrievement, and the Politics of Division and Liberation. A recent article that appeared on the website Vox, titled The Intersectionality Wars, announced that intersectionality might be the most hated word right now in American conservatism. And that's saying a lot. The author, Jane Costin, spoke with the man on the right, the popular Fox News and conservative commentator Ben Shapiro, for his thoughts on intersectionality. which is understood as mutually intersecting systems of social difference and inequality. Shapiro, who had earlier tweeted out this concise insult of the concept. The best part is that he's replying to himself in his tweet, told the reporter Costin this, quote, "I would define intersectionality as, at least the way that I've seen it manifest on college campuses, and a lot on the political left, as a hierarchy of victimhood in which people are considered members of a victim class by virtue of membership in a particular group, and at the intersection of various groups lies the ascent on the hierarchy." But even self-identified liberals have made their contempt for feminist theory and intersectionality known in their attacks on grievance studies. These three researchers, James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian, recently fabricated a number of studies on the topics of race, gender, and sexuality. That journals accepted their dubious studies was evidence, according to the researchers, of the ridiculousness of these topics, or what they call grievance studies. Intersectionality, of course, was an easy punching bag with article titles such as, quote, "Our struggle is my struggle. Solidarity feminism as an intersectional reply to neoliberal and choice feminism," end quote. In defending their actions, the researchers singled out intersectionality as representing identity politics and political correctness run amok. One of the authors, in fact, last year penned an article titled "Why No One Cares Anymore About Feminist Theory." But perhaps the strangest of these strange bedfellows is the new Black Masculinities, an emergent framework that includes Black masculinism in African American studies and Black male studies in philosophy. The new Black Masculinities seeks to elucidate the suffering and death of Black men and boys. Its leading defenders include T. Hassan Johnson, who founded a website on the left of the same name, and Tommy Curry, whose book The Man Knot on the right has emerged as a Bible of sorts for this field. This perspective challenges Black feminism for viewing Black men as perpetrators of violence, but never as victims themselves. Intersectionality is viewed as a trap that wrongly blames Black men for aspiring to be patriarchs who seek power over Black women. Since they perceive that Black feminists have attacked them personally, critics like Johnson and Curry have responded with personal attacks of their own. They indict Black feminists for profiting off careers that caricature and crucify Black men. They claim that Black men are silenced out of fear that speaking out against Black feminism will mean professional alienation. Yet Black feminism is hardly the hegemony that the new Black Masculinities perceives. As the post-truth era views their politics with increasing suspicion, Black feminists time and again are forced to defend the legitimacy of their work. And with intersectionality now the lingua franca of gender studies programs everywhere, Jennifer Nash has lamented how Black feminists have tried to protect intersectionality as their exclusive property. Other commentators are discouraged at how an apocalyptic outlook has overshadowed Black feminism's once hopeful and liberatory politics. My presentation today is drawn from a chapter co-authored with my colleague Saida Grundy of Boston University. It's appearing in the forthcoming volume Black Feminist Sociology, edited by Whitney Pirtle and Zakia Luna. But our chapter remains a work in progress, and so I welcome your questions and comments. With Black feminism on its heels, we ask, what explains this antipathy towards Black feminism and the strange career of intersectionality? And finally, how do we chart a path forward? As two avowed Black feminist sociologists who study Black manhood, we rebuff the notion that supporting the very real cause of struggling Black men and boys obliges us to reject Black feminism. I demonstrate rather that the new Black Masculinities rehearses what Professor Grundy and I call Black male aggrievement, an ideology that anchors conservative gender politics to its explicitly anti-racist motivations, and claims injury at the hands of Black feminism as a field, and Black women in particular. Black male aggrievement and the antagonism between Black feminism and the new Black Masculinities has been nurtured by a neoliberal academy that delegitimizes Black critical scholarship and feeds off conflict between progressive movements. In the second half of my presentation, I turn to our own complementary research on schools targeted to young Black men, to highlight how conservative politics animates programmatic efforts to uplift young Black men. These efforts promote Black male exceptionalism, or the idea that Black men are more deserving of help than other groups. the new Black masculinities and the neoliberal ideologies which guide these initiatives are, in fact, rooted in an old brand of progressive conservatism, which insists that racial liberalism and traditional conservatism can be reconciled through corporate solutions. In an historical moment marked by the disposability of Black life and the vulnerability of Black feminism, we need Black feminism more than ever, one, we argue, grounded in a politics of caring and reparations. And before I continue, I note that I speak with the awareness of my own positionality and identity as someone who's not African American, but as a scholar and a teacher concerned with improving the lives of Black women and men, girls and boys, and with how feminism is vital in that cause. Black feminism unearths, critiques, and attacks the forces of gendered racism. Not merely a challenge to white patriarchy, Black feminism is also critical of misogyny and sexual violence within the Black community. Inaugural theorizing of intersectionality demonstrated how legal narratives in the U.S. obfuscate sexual violence against Black women when they advance a lynching trope or historical racial violence which assumes a Black male victim, or they advance a rape trope or historical sexual violence which assumes a white female victim. Black women historically have been pressured to choose racial solidarity over their own needs. Attempts to call out sexism and sexual violence within the Black community have historically been met with silencing tactics in order to, quote, not bring a good brother down. My co-author Saida Grundy addresses this very topic in this article, which was published earlier this year in The Atlantic. Grundy asks why Black women would support the singer R. Kelly, who has been accused of being a sexual predator. Black feminism has been described as thriving, dying, and on the defensive. Popular memoirs by Black women, including the New York Times bestseller Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay, and Tressie McMillan Cotton's book Thick, the two books on the left, have helped sustain public interest in Black feminism, while exposing rifts between a perceived bourgeois academic feminism and its grassroots politics. This expanded interest in Black feminism has been met with strong resistance to intersectionality, the tradition's most wide-reaching and influential contribution. Detractors view it as a dressed-up version of identity politics where marginalized groups often claim victimhood in a pitiful display. Conservatives regard it as dangerous to claim that oppressed groups do, in fact, experience multiple forms of oppression. And some white critics view it as a form of white bashing and reverse discrimination. Even still, Black feminism remains a minority discourse that constantly needs to justify its worth. Black feminism has become increasingly vulnerable in the face of the Trump administration's relentless attack on higher education. And as faculty positions become more scarce in our age of austerity, academics of all stripes claim the mantle of objective science to dismiss Black feminism as unscientific me-search. Over 30 years ago, Hazel Carby worried that demands for legitimacy had made Black feminism appear overwhelmingly defensive. Most recently, Jennifer Nash, in her book Black Feminism Imagined, here second from the right, has shared the same sentiment. Nash has also found regrettable how Black feminists have made a proprietary claim to intersectionality, policing the concept, as she sees it, in a manner that divides Black women from other feminist scholars of color. With Black feminism at a crossroads, some, like Brittany Cooper, in her memoir on the far right, wonders if Black feminism has a future at all. The seeming demise of Black feminism comes amid the increasing precariousness of Black women's lives, who, for example, experience disproportionately poor health outcomes and face high maternal mortality rates. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Black women in the U.S. suffer 3 times as many pregnancy-related deaths than white women. With Black feminism on the defensive, the advocates of the new Black masculinities have come out swinging. Black feminism, in this view, is seen as a roadblock to a truly critical study of Black masculinity. The backers of the new Black masculinities allege that while Black feminism claims in theory to account for Black men, gender is instead taken to be synonymous with women. Therefore, actually existing intersectional accounts prioritize Black women's experiences and demean Black men and boys, who are viewed as aspiring white patriarchs. Under the rubric of Black feminism, Black men and boys are assailants and never victims of gendered racism and sexual violence. These proponents accuse the Academy of legitimizing theories of Black men rooted in what is actually racist misandry, or a fear and hatred of black men. I acknowledge the good intentions behind the new Black Masculinities. Surely we can do more to understand and respond to the suffering and death of black men and boys. This framework addresses difficult topics such as an overlooked history of how black men in the U.S. have been victims of sexual assault, often at the hands of white women. But Professor Grundy and I are concerned with the larger implications. While the new Black Masculinities is new in name, it relies on an old formula, a progressive anti-racist agenda anchored in an anti-feminist conservative gender politics and often a conservative class politics, or what we call black male aggrievement. Here, the legal roots of aggrievement help to underscore how advocates of the new Black Masculinities make a claim to injury at the hands of black feminism and black women scholars. Instead of rejecting intersectionality, however, we argue that this ideology repackages it as a framework that is anti-racist but patriarchal. By trading feminism for anti-racism, the new Black Masculinities ultimately views power as a two-dimensional field. It is marred by a zero-sum seesaw logic where black men must be down and black women are up. The new Black Masculinities resorts to a kind of basic accounting of disadvantage. For example, in his critique of black feminism, T. Hassan Johnson reduces all social measures to privilege, which results in awkward phrasings such as rape and domestic violence privilege, and creates graphs comparing black male privileges to black female privileges, which obscures the forces of patriarchal whiteness which produce those disadvantages. This comparison flattens the impact of those structures, ideologies, and policies that advantage whites over others. In this representative table, Johnson rejects the notion of black male privilege not by accounting for the myriad ways that black men are disadvantaged compared to their white peers, but by enumerating ad nauseum the specific advantages black men and black women have over one another. With its narrow focus on privilege, the new Black Masculinities overlooks the historical record showing how patriarchal assumptions and institutions still dominate black civil and political society. The seesaw logic of the new Black Masculinities posits a black male exceptionalism, or the claim that, in the words of Paul Butler, quote, by almost every index of inequality, black males are on the bottom, end quote. For instance, Tommy Curry, a leading figure in black male studies, writes that the neglect of black men and boys in gender studies is a form of racial chauvinism, and that his book, The Man Not, dares to show how in many cases black men are more disadvantaged than black women. As he writes, quote, in our current political disciplinary milieu, patriarchy is thought to direct its violence primarily towards women through misogyny, despite the historical and sociological findings that show Western patriarchy to be a structural system that directs its most lethal violence against racialized outgroup males while preserving the lives of females through paternalism, end quote. While Curry acknowledges white patriarchy as a structural system, his framing creates an uncomfortable situation where readers are asked to choose the side of black men by virtue of the degree of mortal violence enacted on them. Much in the same way that Johnson in the previous slide characterizes black women as more privileged than black men under a system of white patriarchy, Curry here awkwardly implies that the lives of black women are more preserved than those of black men and therefore suffer less than black men. The new Black Masculinities replaces black feminism with questionable theories. The various threads of the new Black Masculinities have found a guiding light in the sociologist Robert Staples, the main progenitor of the original Black Masculinity studies of the 1970s. According to Curry, Staples' research demonstrates that black men have different expectations of manhood than do white men. Yet Staples' own writing betrays Curry's assertion, and gender theorists have largely dismissed the work of Staples for its blatant sexism. For instance, Staples has argued that middle-class black men screen out strong black women as partners because they prefer more feminine and therefore submissive women. He's called it the, quote, masculine perquisite of black men to desert female partners who are decision makers in the home. Throughout his writing, Staples' contempt for black women is on display. For example, Staples has claimed that the best and brightest of all black men normally do not marry black women. The new Black Masculinities is also deeply heteronormative. As T. Hassan Johnson claims, intersectionality is popular mostly because of the relative lack of black men in higher education. as he writes, quote, "The rightness of intersectionality theory is not based on the merits of black feminism per se, but rather on the predominant numbers of black females who comprise the Black Academy, especially in gender studies where courses are mostly taught by women, to women, and for women." In another example of Johnson's seesaw logic, black feminism would be less popular and considered less accurate if there were simply greater numbers of black men in the academy. Yet Johnson overlooks several realities. First, he ignores how discourse of black intellectualism has traditionally been rendered male in the United States. As Hazel Carby has argued, the structures of thought and feeling, respectable aesthetics, and influence of the black church's own cis-normative and patriarchal tradition have cohered in a black male intellectual tradition inaugurated by W.E.B. Du Bois on the left, and which has been emulated today by other preacher intellectuals such as Cornel West, who's on the right. Second, Johnson implies that having more black men in the academy would weaken the impact of intersectionality and presumably strengthen the new black masculinities. Yet his assertion overlooks a tradition of black feminist scholarship where black men have worked alongside black women as allies. In this tradition, black men and women work together to confront how black men equate strength with patriarchal domination, but often in ways that harm both women and men. Third, it's revealing that the male proponents of the new black masculinities have mainly criticized black women and not other male scholars. And last, this heteronormativity of the new black masculinities further reveals itself when we account for how black feminism has long been an intellectual and political base for queer black scholarship and politics. In this time of black suffering and death, black feminist sociology can reorient thinking about the purpose and potential of intersectionality. Intersectionality can help us to understand the specificity of gendered racism for each group under white patriarchy and how violence suffered by black men and black women are connected. We should embrace intersectionality, in the words of Rose Brewer, as a recreative framework that can help repair the damaged relationship between black feminism and the new black masculinities. As Audre Lorde, seen here, writes, quote, "We cannot afford to do our enemies' work by destroying each other," end quote. I therefore here encourage less an epistemological view of intersectionality, which highlights the particular standpoints of black men and women, and more a systemic view of intersectionality in which mutually dependent forces of oppression divide potential allies in the service of hegemony. It's not surprising that black feminism and the new black masculinities are at odds today when higher education is under attack from a cruel brand of neoliberalism. The neoliberal university relishes tension between black feminist scholars and defenders of the new black masculinities. It can absolve itself of any responsibility to resolve conflict, knowing that losses in courses, departments, and programs, and the faculty who staff them can be chalked up to necessary downsizing and cost-cutting. As resources dry up, institutions have invested in technological fields, which themselves are disproportionately white, and sleek facilities in order to attract investors, making structural spending less of a priority. As Joel Noonan has written, a new managerialism has been an assault on universities in Canada, as a growing and more professionalized class of university administrators manages finances and promotes growth in a manner at odds with the interests of faculty and students. Neoliberal ideologies built on divisiveness, competition over scarce resources, and a post-race and post-feminist worldview have fed the gender-conservative, cis-normative, and zero-sum politics of black male aggrievement. The new black masculinities, therefore, has been seduced by the neoliberal project. Like the new black masculinities, the neoliberal embrace among black elites is not altogether new. It can be traced back to the progressive conservatism of 1960s black politics and elites that turned to entrepreneurialism, free market solutions, and public-private partnerships as pathways to social mobility. As Leah Wright Regier has argued, and as I'll go into greater depth later in the presentation, one of the disconcerting features of Barack Obama's presidency was that it shares many of the principles of what we're calling black male aggrievement. Behind Obama's seemingly progressive campaign built on hope and change resided a commitment to non-radical socioeconomic policies that are strikingly similar to those of black conservatives dating back to the 1960s. While intersectionality can help sift through the wreckage of neoliberalism, gender studies courses are increasingly on the chopping block just as they're needed the most. This is a global phenomenon. The assault on intellectual elites in the U.S. is tied to a larger far-right antagonism towards gender studies across Europe, in places such as Italy, Sweden, and most notably Hungary, where recently gender studies programs were abolished altogether. In this image from this past March, women in Italy protest outside the meeting of the World Congress of Families, a Christian right organization that has been hostile to feminism and the rights of LGBT persons. Back in the United States, black men and women remain sorely underrepresented in higher education. In 2017, black students made up only 5.4% of the nearly 55,000 PhDs awarded in the US. In many fields, not a single doctorate went to a black student. Black women have been especially hit hard following the 2008 Great Recession, as they take on some of the greatest loan debt and then face the largest wage gaps when they enter the labor market. One of the unfortunate consequences of the small numbers of black students and faculty on campuses is that the work of theorizing whiteness and masculinity remains largely in the hands of white scholars, whose exclusionary practices include squeezing out the contributions of non-white researchers. Meanwhile, a black feminist pedagogy based on collaboration, caring, and communion faces a growing threat from the neoliberal university's bare pedagogy, in the words of Henry Giroux, one premised on isolation and competition. And still largely shut out from more secure tenure-track positions, scholars of color have flooded the expanding class of precariously situated contingent faculty. Neoliberalism's common-sense ideologies have spread to every level and corner of U.S. education. In an era of privatization, a number of odd bedfellows, corporations and faith-based organizations, politicians across the political divide, compete for opportunities to solve the crisis of young black men. Like the theories on which the new Black Masculinities relies, these efforts reinforce class and gender divisions as they promote a more explicitly anti-racist agenda. In the remainder of my presentation, I present this through an analysis of the federal initiative My Brother's Keeper and discuss how this effort at black male uplift resonates in our respective scholarship on black male institutions, my research on all-male public schools, and Saida Grundy's study of Morehouse College. On May 19, 2013, then U.S. President Barack Obama spoke at the rain-soaked commencement at Morehouse College, the prestigious college for black men in Atlanta, Georgia. The president, whose rise to the Oval Office had reset the bar on the heights of black male achievement for the nation, gave no ordinary lesson to this unique audience of college graduates. Let's hear a snippet from the speech. Here we go.
We know that too many young men in our community continue to make bad choices. And I have to say, growing up, I made quite a few myself. Sometimes I wrote off my own failings as just another example of the world trying to keep a black man down. I had a tendency sometimes to make excuses for me not doing the right thing. But one of the things that all of you have learned over the last 4 years is there's no longer any room for excuses. I understand there's a common fraternity creed here at Morehouse. Excuses are tools of the incompetent, used to build bridges to nowhere and monuments of nothingness. Well, we've got no time for excuses. Not because the bitter legacy of slavery and segregation have vanished entirely, they have not. Not because racism and discrimination no longer exist. We know those are still out there. It's just that in today's hyper-connected, hyper-competitive world, with millions of young people from China and India and Brazil, many of whom started with a whole lot less than all of you did, all of them entering the global workforce alongside you, nobody is going to give you anything that you have not earned. Nobody cares how tough your upbringing was. Nobody cares if you suffered some discrimination. And moreover, you have to remember that whatever you've gone through, it pales in comparison to the hardships previous generations endured, and they overcame them. And if they overcame them, you can overcome them too. You now hail from a lineage and legacy of immeasurably strong men. Men who bore tremendous burdens and still laid the stones for the path on which we now walk. You wear the mantle of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and Ralph Bunche and Langston Hughes and George Washington Carver and Ralph Abernathy and Thurgood Marshall and, yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. These men were many things to many people, and they knew full well the role that racism played in their lives. But when it came to their own accomplishments and sense of purpose, they had no time for excuses. Every one of you have a grandma or an uncle or a parent who's told you that at some point in life, as an African American, you have to work twice as hard as anyone else if you want to get by. I think President Mays put it even better. He said, whatever you do, strive to do it so well that no man living and no man dead and no man yet to be born can do it any better. And I promise you what was needed in Dr. May's time, that spirit of excellence and hard work and dedication and no excuses, is needed now more than ever.
Okay, we'll stop there. So what I want to highlight in the snippet is Obama's, the emphasis Obama places on hard work, self-help, and personal responsibility, and making the right choices as antidotes to racial oppression. He places a tremendous burden on the black men before him to choose not to make excuses, because if their ancestors overcame hardships, then the Morehouse men had no choice but to do the same. This, of course, ignores how many of their ancestors likely tried plenty hard but still could do little to overcome structural racism and structural violence. Obama acknowledges the enduring legacies of slavery, but in keeping with the tradition of black neoliberalism and progressive conservatism, he offers being a hard worker in a competitive global economy as the best possible pathway out of racism. While Obama's rise to the presidency was viewed as a beam of hope amid the 2008 Great Recession, neoliberal factions on both the left and the right forced the Obama administration to become more conservative over time. As much as Obama praised the graduates, he also admonished them for the problems of their group. Ultimately, Obama charged the graduates with the daunting task of taking the helm of black racial advancement. Your generation, he said, is uniquely poised for success unlike any generation of African Americans that came before it. Too few of our brothers have the opportunities that you've had here at Morehouse. His words would grow weighty. Quote, there are some things as Morehouse men that you are obliged to do for those still left behind. Excuses are the rhetoric of the incompetent, he said. Nobody cares if you suffered from discrimination. Before these educated black men was a cleanup job of the embarrassment to the race attributed to their disadvantaged counterparts. How did we arrive here where young black men are upheld as the saviors of the race and lambasted as its most likely detriment? How has this paradox of promise and peril driven efforts to promote black male achievement? Professor Grundy's scholarship and my own have critiqued both the masculinist constructions of young black men's problems and how responses to these supposed problems expose how intersectionality has been repurposed to oddly anti-feminist ends. While efforts at black male achievement most obviously penalize black womanhood, they also injure black men, especially those at the margins of class and sexuality. And they dangerously endorse the notion that the advancement of the race is yoked first and foremost to the advancement of black men. The Morehouse speech was a promotional stop for Obama, who a year later unveiled this program called My Brother's Keeper, a 2014 initiative targeting African American and Latino boys. In its official literature, the White House describes the purpose of the initiative as addressing persistent opportunity gaps facing these groups. The critics of My Brother's Keeper included 200 black men who signed an open letter to the president which stressed that, quote, the absence of any comparable initiative for females forces us to ask where the complex lives of black women and girls fit into the White House's vision of racial justice. The initiative's focus on boys at the expense of girls was one glimpse into Obama's enduring conservative gender politics. In speeches, for example, the former president has been known to draw on a tired narrative of absent or uninvolved Black fathers as a major reason for the disadvantages that Black youth face. But what fell below the radar were the politically curious origins of My Brother's Keeper. Seated in the U.S. Department of Justice, the program's neoliberal ideas about personal responsibility, law and order, and Black male criminality have brought both Black and white conservatives to the same table as left-of-center Black community advocates. The launch of My Brother's Keeper was supported by such right-wing figureheads as Bill O'Reilly, who's famously railed that Black poverty rates are driven by the dissolution of Black families. The organization's advisory board is littered with business executives and private sector conglomerates, such as Prudential and Deloitte, and in that way mirrors many public schools today. Still, the corporatization of Black community-based initiatives has been met with enthusiasm. As an example of social justice capitalism, privatization has helped relieve community angst over what to do with Black boys. A curious coalition has formed around Black boys in which Black community leaders and white neoliberal conservatives believe that corporate debts to Black communities is a form of economic justice, and the congruent ideology that private sector action is more effective for Black Americans than big government social welfare programs. My Brother's Keeper is an exemplar of what Michael Dumas has called neoliberal governmentality, where big business innovations are offered as a way to fix the perceived character flaws of Black male youth. The same has been forged on the grounds of all-male public schools targeting Black boys. When the city of Chicago, Illinois rolled out its own citywide My Brother's Keeper initiative in 2015, leading the way was Tim King, the CEO and co-founder of Urban Prep Academies, the most well-known of these schools. Pictured here are some of the young men from this academy. In the early 1990s, efforts to open these schools in places like Milwaukee and Detroit stalled for one important reason. Courts ruled they were unlawful because there were no attempts to create similar schools for Black girls. The efforts thus promoted the idea of Black male exceptionalism. Today's era of school privatization, however, has breathed new life into these academies by defending them as one possible option among many for Black families. The embrace of expanded choice as a solution to inequalities has attracted a number of strange bedfellows. The proponents for these schools include the left-leaning Open Society Foundation, which backs anti-racist criminal justice reform, and the conservative Walton Family Foundation, a pro-choice and affirmative action opponent. Such proponents have argued that Black-white achievement gaps require a radical intervention in the schooling of Black boys, despite feminist detractors citing that the performance gap between white and Black girls is actually wider than that between white and Black boys. Like My Brother's Keeper, Black male academies have garnered conservative support by falling in step with foundational right-of-center ideologies about ending state-run schools and diminishing the power of teachers' unions. In bringing together liberals and conservatives in these ways, these Black male academies hit, in the words of Kimberly Crenshaw, quote, a political sweet spot among populations that both love and fear them. The institutional cultures of Black male achievement are just as paradoxically a mashup of racial advancement ideologies and conservative practices about behavioral modeling, discipline, and morality. I demonstrate this in my book, Black Boys Apart, a year-long ethnographic study of two such Black male academies in a large city on the East Coast of the U.S. Following a state takeover of the public school system, one of these schools, Northside Academy, which is a pseudonym, assembled a board of trustees featuring many of the city's elite, which secured large funds that were unfathomable to most public schools. The school also embraced its own version of progressive conservatism and cultivated a sense of tradition in the form of mandatory Latin curricula and a strict uniform of blazers and ties to show that their gentlemanly students possess the disciplined minds and bodies to distinguish them from their more disadvantaged and unworthy peers. Northside Academy drew on many of the principles behind My Brother's Keeper, and in doing so gave a contemporary spin to rather old ideologies. Northside rehearsed a form of respectability politics, first introduced by Black elites and Black church leaders following the end of slavery, which demanded the cultivation of character behaviors such as strict obedience, thriftiness, and proper manners as a way of earning the acceptance of mainstream white America. These politics have intensified with the emergence of a character education industry over the past 15 years. This industry promotes the idea that in order to be successful, poor youth should cultivate non-cognitive skills such as perseverance, optimism, and self-confidence. In both the U.S. and Canada, this now lucrative industry has been led by psychologists. Angela Duckworth is considered the pioneer of this movement in the U.S., and her research has been taken up in schools such as KIPP, a popular charter school network which quantifies student character, including attributes such as zest and self-control, and administers a report card in the center. All across Canada, including at this secondary school pictured on the right in Abbotsford, schools have implemented the character curriculum manufactured by psychologists at MeritCorps, a Calgary-based consulting firm. Students at these schools are also given character grades on their report cards. Ontario started mandating character education in its schools 13 years ago, a move that coincided with increasing concern that minority and Indigenous students were lagging behind academically. But I want to highlight two things here. First is that we should be concerned with how public schools are more likely to implement research by psychologists. Second is the more alarming development of how, under neoliberal education, grit and character skills are embraced as risk and responsibility are transferred from institutions to individuals. Canadian educational researchers have also found that character education supports an assimilationist conception of social cohesion under the rubric of shared national values, which does little to challenge existing power structures. Much of the cultural curricula and character education for black male high schools were inspired by Morehouse College. In this picture, students at a black male academy in Washington, D.C. link arms and form a circle around their older brothers or mentors from Morehouse, who form a smaller inner circle at the center of the room. In her forthcoming book, Manhood Within the Margins, The Paradoxes of Making Masculinity at the Historically Black College for Men, my co-author Saida Grundy shows how culture of black male respectability at Morehouse narrowly constructs racial leadership within a promotion of neoliberal individualism. Grundy's interviews with graduates revealed that racial leadership was most often understood as a default status of individual accomplishment, buttressed by masculinist ideals of ambition, personal responsibility, and individual merit. When asked how Morehouse men improved conditions for black men writ large, one of her respondents replied, quote, "The beginning of improving black communities is not to be a black man whose condition need be improved. Our broader responsibility is not only to be examples to the community, but to empower people to do that in their own communities," end quote. This promotion of neoliberal ideologies within notions of leadership lent themselves easily to prioritizing individual pathways to upward mobility. Business administration has long been the most popular major at Morehouse, and a culture of corporatization permeates student life and curricula beyond those interested in business careers. Similarly, the high school boys in my book were groomed to be leaders of industry, or what I call ambitious entrepreneurs. Mandatory courses in business etiquette teach the Morehouse men to tie Windsor knots, give firm handshakes, and recognize shrimp forks in preparation for interviews with highly coveted Wall Street firms. The years of abiding by black male respectability practices are finally met with the reward of being placed in view of recruiters seeking politically palatable and well-groomed employees. Corporate careers become the capstone in the schooling of black male achievement. That several of their classmates advanced from Morehouse onto lucrative careers in banking and finance was pointed to as proof of Morehouse's contribution to the black community leadership. In this thinking, the involvement of black men in corporate leadership produces trickle-down race betterment, where black men steer capitalist enterprises towards anti-racist ends. Like a sequel to the embossed blazers and motivational messaging of the black male high schools in my own research, a culture of respectability defined the Morehouse milieu. These institutions double down on character education as the necessary effort against a belief that black men face additional barriers to mobility. There is, however, an irony that the desirability of Morehouse-educated employees is credited to personal responsibility and free market ideologies, when policies such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act set in motion the affirmative action hiring practices of the 1970s and beyond. It was the federal government's concession to black activists, not the desirability for black job candidates, that set the anti-discrimination clauses in which employers sought to protect themselves against discrimination charges by hiring enough minorities to counteract any statistical charges of racial imbalance. Of all the perverse political contortions of Black male achievement initiatives, perhaps the most glaring is the credit given to free markets as the most effective path to racial gains, when a history of Black social justice and legislation belies any such belief. Black male achievement initiatives appear praiseworthy in their focus on individualistic prescriptions for correcting young Black men, but they promote a narrowly constructive narrative of case-by-case Black male success that denies the reality of how those issues came to exist and the scope of structural interventions required to redress them. In conclusion, as feminist sociologists of Black masculinity writing in an era of deepening class divides, a resurgence in ethnic nationalism and white supremacy, continued gender-based violence and increasing anti-feminist sentiments, and school-based initiatives that trade structural interventions for assessing the moral fitness of Black youth, Saida, Grundy, and I insist that our field needs more Black feminism. It is a Black feminism that continues to demand self-reflexivity in male scholars. It's one that's critical of the sexist behaviors of men without pathologizing them. In the words of Tarana Burke, Me Too, the movement she founded, was never intended as a vindictive plot against men. The Black feminism we imagine is a deeply caring politics, one that shines a light on the myriad forces that promote intraracial divisions and helps to rehabilitate those divisions. Jennifer Nash has called for love in the time of death, or for Black feminists to embrace radical intimacies with other women of color. We end with a call for a radical allyship needed to fight a white supremacy abetted and authorized by patriarchy and protected by the post-race and post-feminist cloak of neoliberalism. What we must do, Audre Lorde writes, is commit ourselves to some future that can include each other and to work toward that future with the strengths of our individual identities, end quote. While I have been critical of the new Black Masculinities, I welcome opportunities to engage with its proponents and to work together to find that common future. We might imagine a Black feminist future where an allyship of Black feminism and a newer Black Masculinities is united against all forms of state and intimate violence against Black populations. Professor Grundy and I envision a Black feminist politics of caring and reparations, which recognizes Black women and men as worthy of recognition and pursues holistic socioeconomic policies to address historical injustices. We should not lose sight of the original vision of the Coahumbé River Collective, whose members are seen here on the bottom left in their groundbreaking Black feminist statement published 40 years ago. When asked why the collective's Black feminism remains relevant today, founder Barbara Smith observed, quote, "The reason Coahumbé's Black feminism is so powerful is because it's anti-capitalist. One would expect Black feminism to be anti-racist as opposed to sexism. Anti-capitalism is what gives it the sharpness and the revolutionary potential," end quote. So even if Black feminism must let go of intersectionality as its exclusive property, it can hold on more firmly to a praxis that honors the still radical political commitments of which the Coahumbé River Collective speaks. Thank you.